Civilization did not begin as a slow crawl toward the light. It erupted in the heart of Africa as a sophisticated mastery of the natural world. Long before the first foundations of Rome were laid, African empires were already mapping the stars, smelting iron, and dictating the flow of global wealth. To understand the rise of the first great states, we must look at the land itself. Thousands of years ago, the Sahara was not the void we know today. It was a green, lush savanna, teeming with life and crisscrossed by rivers. But as the climate shifted and the rains failed, humanity was forced into a strategic retreat. This migration created a pressure cooker of innovation. People gathered along the lifelines of the continent, the Nile, the Niger, and the highlands of the East. They didn't just survive, they organized. They mastered the seasonal floods. They domesticated indigenous crops. And most importantly, they built a social architecture that allowed thousands of people to work toward a single unified purpose. Geography was the architect, trade was the fuel, and the result was a series of connected civilizations that would define the ancient world. Our story begins in the north, in the long, fertile corridor of the Nile Valley. While history books often treat Egypt as an isolated miracle, it was part of a much broader Nilotic culture. In the pre-dynastic era, the foundations of African kingship were laid here. The concept of the divine ruler, a leader who bridged the gap between the heavens and the earth, emerged from these riverbank communities. They developed complex irrigation systems that required centralized management. This led to the world's first bureaucracies. But the Nile did not end at the borders of Egypt. To the south lay a land the ancients called Ta Seti, the land of the bow. This was the dawn of the Nile Valley civilization, where wealth was measured in cattle, grain, and the mastery of the river's unpredictable temperament. As we move upriver, deeper into the African interior, we find the kingdom of Kush. For centuries, Kush was viewed merely as a shadow of Egypt. The reality is far more compelling. Based in the city of Kerma, the Kushites developed a unique and formidable culture. They were masters of archery and trade, controlling the flow of ivory, incense, and gold from the African heartland to the Mediterranean. By 2500 BCE, Kerma was one of the largest urban centers in the world outside of Egypt. The relationship between the two powers was one of constant tension and cultural exchange. Eventually, the pendulum of power swung south. In the 8th century BCE, the Kushite king Paye marched north. He conquered the entirety of Egypt, establishing the 25th dynasty. For nearly a century, black pharaohs ruled from the confluence of the Niles to the shores of the Mediterranean, reunifying a fractured Egypt and reviving its ancient traditions with new southern energy. When the Kushite kings eventually retreated from Egypt under pressure from Assyrian invaders, they did not collapse. They transformed. They moved their capital further south to Meroe, a location that would change the technological trajectory of the continent. Meroe sat between the Nile and the Atbara rivers. Crucially, it was surrounded by vast forests and rich iron ore deposits. Here, the Kushites developed a massive iron-smelting industry. Archaeologists have found hills of slag so large they were once mistaken for natural formations. Meroe became the Birmingham of ancient Africa. They forged tools that revolutionized agriculture and weapons that defended their sovereignty. They developed their own script, Meroitic, which remains one of the great undeciphered puzzles of linguistics. They built hundreds of pyramids, smaller and steeper than those at Giza, marking the graves of queens known as Kandakis, powerful female regents who led armies and governed with absolute authority. As the power of Meroe began to wane in the 4th century CE, a new star rose to the east, the Kingdom of Axum, located in the highlands of modern-day Ethiopia and Eritrea. Axum was perfectly positioned to become a global trade hub. Its port city of Adulis linked the African interior to the Roman Empire, India, and Persia. While other civilizations relied on river systems, Axum mastered the Red Sea. They were an empire of architects and engineers. They carved massive, monolithic obelisks known as stelae from single blocks of stone, some standing over 100 feet tall. These were markers of a state so wealthy it minted its own currency in gold, silver, and bronze, a mark of true sovereignty in the ancient world. Axum was also a crossroads of ideas. It was one of the first empires in the world to officially adopt Christianity, yet it maintained deep ties with the Arabian Peninsula. It was a cosmopolitan, literate, and militarily potent state that the Persian philosopher Mani described as one of the 4 greatest powers on earth, alongside Rome, Persia, and China. The fall of Axum and the shift in Red Sea trade routes did not end African complexity. It moved it. Across the vast Sahel, the shore of the desert, trade routes began to solidify. The introduction of the camel revolutionized the Sahara. What was once a barrier became a highway. The gold of the south and the salt of the north needed a middleman. They needed a protector. They needed a state that could guarantee the safety of the caravans. This necessity gave birth to the first of the great West African empires. Deep in the grasslands between the Senegal and Niger rivers, the Soninke people established the Ouagadougou Empire, known to the world as ancient Ghana. Emerging around the 4th century CE, Ghana was a masterpiece of political organization. The king, known as the Ghana, held a monopoly on all gold nuggets found in the realm, while the people traded in gold dust. This kept the value of the metal stable and the royal treasury overflowing. The capital, Kumbi Saleh, was a twin city. One half was the royal residence, a place of traditional African spirituality and government. The other half was a bustling merchant quarter, home to Muslim traders from the north. This dual structure allowed Ghana to embrace global trade without losing its cultural identity. Ghana did not have a standing army in the modern sense. Instead, the king could summon 200,000 warriors at a moment's notice. It was a state built on the iron tools of Meroe's legacy and the commercial networks of the Sahara. It was the first proof that the West African interior could sustain an empire that rivaled anything in Europe or Asia. We must view these civilizations not as isolated pockets of progress, but as a linked chain. The gold of Ghana eventually found its way to the mints of Europe. The incense of Axum burned in the temples of Rome. The iron of Meroe cleared the forests of Central Africa. Africa was never a dark continent waiting to be discovered. It was a vibrant, interconnected web of scholars, merchants, and engineers. The Trans-Saharan routes were the Silk Roads of the West. The Red Sea was the Mediterranean of the South. These civilizations were the engines of global liquidity and the pioneers of international law and diplomacy. The history of early Africa is the history of human resilience. It is the story of how people conquered the desert, harnessed the rivers, and built structures, both of stone and of law, that lasted for millennia. When we look at the pyramids of the Nile or the stelae of Axum, we are not looking at outliers. We are looking at the foundational blocks of the human experience. These empires prove that complexity, governance, and innovation are indigenous to the African soil. They remind us that the story of civilization is incomplete if it does not begin in the heart of the continent that gave birth to humanity itself. The ruins of these great states still stand, often silent, beneath the African sun. They are not merely monuments to the dead, but blueprints for the living. They tell us that greatness is not a matter of luck, but a result of organization, vision, and the courage to build where others see only sand and stone. To understand the world as it is today, we must first recognize the giants upon whose shoulders we stand, the kings, the queens, and the innovators of ancient Africa.